The USS Abraham Lincoln's bridge windows had never been cleaner. At 3:47 hours, while most of the carrier's 5,000 crew members slept beneath the Persian Gulf's star-drunk sky, Petty Officer Third Class Joaquin Mop Morales worked his squeegee across the reinforced glass with mechanical precision. The nickname had followed him from basic training, not because he was slow, but because he cleaned everything twice. His fellow sailors assumed it was obsessive-compulsive disorder. They were wrong. Morales pressed his face closer to the glass, watching the horizon through his reflection. 23 years in the Navy, 14 of them scrubbing decks and washing windows, while harboring a secret that would have gotten him court-martialed if discovered. The irony wasn't lost on him that the most dangerous man on this floating city of steel was trusted with a mop bucket and industrial-strength window cleaner. 3 decks below, in the carrier's intelligence center, Lieutenant Commander Evangeline Ghost Reeves sat hunched over satellite imagery that made her stomach clench. The photos showed Iranian fast-attack boats massing near Bandar Abbas, their heat signatures blooming like deadly flowers in the infrared spectrum. At 34, Ghost had logged more combat hours than pilots twice her age, but tonight she felt every mission weighing on her shoulders like stones. Her call sign hadn't come from her pale complexion or quiet demeanor. It came from her ability to appear where enemies least expected her, striking like smoke given form. The red phone on the intelligence desk rang once, cutting through the soft hum of electronics. Ghost's hand hovered over it, knowing that whatever was on the other end would change everything. The voice that emerged was clipped, urgent, speaking in code that chilled her blood. Package inbound. ETA sunrise. Prep the birds. Above them both, Morales squeezed his cleaning rag and felt the familiar weight of the waterproof radio taped beneath his shirt. He'd been waiting for this moment for 3 years, maintaining his cover while watching, listening, preparing. The greatest deception wasn't that a janitor could bring down a carrier. It was that everyone assumed he would want to. As the first pale fingers of dawn stretched across the water, Ghost was already suiting up in the ready room, her flight suit bearing patches from missions that officially never happened. She didn't know that her fate was about to intersect with a man who'd spent over 2 decades perfecting the art of invisibility. She didn't know that the next 12 hours would redefine everything the Navy thought it knew about heroism, sacrifice, and the thin line between enemy and ally. All she knew was that her FA-18 Super Hornet was fueled and armed, and somewhere in the darkness ahead, people were counting on her to come home. The carrier's massive engines hummed beneath them like a mechanical heartbeat, pushing 68,000 tons of American steel through waters that had claimed empires. Neither Ghost nor Morales realized they were about to make history. Lieutenant Commander Evangeline Reeves had been called worse things than Ghost during her 11-year naval career. The Academy boys who'd never seen combat preferred Ice Queen or Robot, delivered with smirks that suggested she'd somehow failed at being properly feminine while succeeding at being exceptionally lethal. She'd stopped caring about their opinions somewhere over the mountains of Afghanistan, when she'd brought home a damaged Hornet and 3 rescued Marines who would never have to explain to their families why they weren't coming back. Ghost's real name appeared on exactly 4 documents: her birth certificate, her commission papers, her personnel file, and the letter she'd written to her younger sister explaining why she'd chosen a life that might end without warning. Everything else knew her as the pilot who could thread a needle at Mach 1.5, who'd never lost a wingman, and who flew with a precision that bordered on supernatural. The Navy had tried to ground her twice, once for being too aggressive, once for being emotionally unavailable. Both times, emergencies had required her particular skill set, and both times she'd proven that her definition of aggressive was everyone else's definition of effective. Now, at 4:12 hours, she stood in the ready room studying weather reports that painted the Persian Gulf as a meteorological minefield. Wind shear at 12,000 feet, sandstorms brewing to the northeast, and visibility dropping as Iranian smoke screens drifted southward from their military exercises. Exercises that looked suspiciously like invasion preparations to anyone who understood the difference between training and positioning. Her fellow pilots filled the room with the nervous energy that preceded every mission, checking equipment and trading jokes that weren't quite funny enough to cut through the tension. Lieutenant Shark Rodriguez cleaned his visor for the fourth time, while Commander Brick Harrison rechecked his nav coordinates with the focus of a man who'd seen too many friends disappear into empty sky. They respected Ghost's skills, but they'd never fully accepted her presence. She was too quiet, too precise, too unwilling to participate in the casual misogyny that military men used to bond over shared exclusion. Ghost had learned to find strength in their dismissal. While they assumed her silence meant uncertainty, she was calculating angles, distances, and probabilities with the speed of the supercomputers that guided her missiles. While they interpreted her refusal to engage with their crude humor as frigidity, she was studying their faces, reading their stress levels, and preparing to keep them alive despite their assumptions about her capabilities. The mission briefing would begin in 18 minutes. Intelligence suggested a routine patrol flight along the Strait of Hormuz, but Ghost's instincts, honed by 100 nights when routine had turned deadly, whispered otherwise. The Iranian boats weren't conducting exercises. They were hunting. And somewhere in the vast electronic network that connected every American ship, plane, and submarine in the region, someone was about to send a signal that would turn the Arabian Sea into a combat zone. She touched the small photo tucked into her helmet, her sister Maria's graduation from medical school, both of them grinning in caps and gowns, representing different ways of saving lives. Ghost had never told anyone about that photo, just as she'd never explained why she flew with a crucifix her grandmother had pressed into her palm before she left for Annapolis. Faith and family were vulnerabilities in a world that demanded complete professional detachment, but they were also anchors that kept her tethered to the reasons she fought. 4 decks above the ready room, Joaquin Morales finished the bridge windows and moved to the communications array, his cleaning supplies providing perfect cover for activities that had nothing to do with maintenance. His weathered hands, calloused from decades of honest work, moved with surprising delicacy as he adjusted settings on equipment that most sailors weren't qualified to touch. Every adjustment was small, subtle, undetectable to casual inspection, but significant enough to create gaps in the carrier's defensive networks. The morning sun was painting the Persian Gulf in shades of gold and crimson, colors that reminded Morales of the desert where he'd spent 3 years learning to become someone else entirely. The transformation hadn't been voluntary. In 2019, during a routine shore leave in Dubai, Morales had been approached by men who knew things about his family that they shouldn't have known. His elderly mother in Tucson, living on Social Security and his Navy allotment. His teenage nephew, smart enough for college but struggling with the kind of poverty that made desperate choices seem reasonable. The men had offered solutions to problems he'd never discussed with anyone, and in exchange, they'd asked only that he continue doing exactly what he was already doing: cleaning, maintaining, and observing. For 3 years, he'd fed them routine information, crew rotations, maintenance schedules, the kind of operational details that seemed harmless in isolation, but painted a comprehensive picture when assembled by skilled analysts. He told himself he was protecting his family while serving his country, that the intelligence he provided was too mundane to matter. But as he watched Iranian naval forces positioning themselves like chess pieces across the Gulf, he realized he'd been naive about the cumulative power of seemingly insignificant information. This morning was different. The encrypted message he'd received 12 hours earlier hadn't asked for information. It had provided instructions, specific technical modifications that would create vulnerabilities in the carrier's defensive systems at precisely the moment when Iranian fast-attack boats launched their coordinated assault. For the first time in 3 years, they weren't asking him to observe and report. They were asking him to act. Morales's hands trembled as he completed the final adjustment to the radar array's sensitivity settings. The change would delay threat detection by exactly 47 seconds, not enough to cripple the ship's defenses, but enough to give attacking boats a critical advantage during the opening moments of an engagement. He'd convinced himself that 47 seconds couldn't make the difference between life and death, but his conscience knew better. As he gathered his cleaning supplies and prepared to move to the next section of the ship, Morales caught sight of pilots emerging from the ready room, their flight suits bearing the patches and insignia of warriors who'd never questioned his right to be among them. He recognized Lieutenant Commander Reeves, the quiet one they called Ghost, who nodded respectfully to the enlisted crew while her fellow officers barely acknowledged their existence. She carried herself with the controlled grace of someone who understood that confidence came from competence, not from the need to prove superiority. Watching her climb the ladder toward the flight deck, Morales felt something break inside his chest. In 40 minutes, she would be flying into a trap that he had helped create. The flight deck of a nuclear aircraft carrier at dawn resembles a choreographed war dance performed by giants. 200 sailors in color-coded jerseys moved across the deck with practiced urgency, each crew member's role essential to the complex ballet of launching 70,000-pound fighters into hostile sky. Ghost stepped onto the steel deck and felt the familiar surge of adrenaline that came from standing at the intersection of cutting-edge technology and ancient human courage. Her FA-18E Super Hornet waited in the pre-flight area, its gray-blue camouflage designed to vanish against sky and water. The aircraft represented 40 years of evolutionary engineering, twin engines capable of pushing her beyond the speed of sound, radar systems that could track targets over 100 miles away, and weapon systems precise enough to thread a missile through a car window from 10 miles up. But for all its technological sophistication, the Hornet was ultimately a delivery system for something much simpler: the judgment, skill, and determination of its pilot. Ghost completed her walk-around inspection with the methodical attention that had kept her alive through 2 combat deployments. She checked the alignment of control surfaces, verified the security of external fuel tanks, and ran her hands along the aircraft's skin, feeling for stress cracks or impact damage that might compromise performance when her life depended on the machine's integrity. The yellow-shirted ordnance crew had loaded her pylons with a mix of air-to-air and air-to-surface missiles, a configuration that suggested their patrol mission might become something more complicated without warning. As she climbed into the cockpit, Ghost caught sight of Lieutenant Rodriguez preparing his own aircraft 2 spots down. Shark was a capable pilot, but he flew with the aggressive confidence of someone who'd never been truly tested. He assumed that superior technology and training guaranteed victory, an assumption that had gotten better men killed when they encountered enemies who compensated for technological disadvantages with determination, cunning, and the desperate creativity of people fighting for their homeland. The electronic warfare officer's voice crackled through her helmet radio. "Ghost, you're cleared for engine start. Weather's degrading to the northeast, but you should have clear sky for the first hour of patrol." She began the engine start sequence, feeling the twin F414 turbofans wind up to their idle power setting with the distinctive whistle that had become the soundtrack of her professional life. The Hornet systems came online with the satisfying completeness of a machine, designed to function flawlessly under conditions that would destroy lesser equipment. Through her heads-up display, Ghost watched the carrier's air traffic control center coordinating the launch sequence for 6 aircraft. The morning patrol would consist of 2 FA-18 Super Hornets, 2 F-35C Lightning II stealth fighters, and 2 EA-18G Growler electronic warfare platforms. On paper, it represented enough firepower to sink a small navy. In reality, it was a reconnaissance force designed to monitor Iranian naval activities and provide early warning if diplomatic tensions escalated into active conflict. What Ghost didn't know was that diplomatic tensions had already crossed that threshold 12 hours earlier, when Iranian Revolutionary Guard commanders had finalized plans for a coordinated assault designed to close the Strait of Hormuz and demonstrate their ability to control the world's most critical shipping lane. The morning patrol wasn't flying into a routine reconnaissance mission. It was flying into the opening moments of a carefully orchestrated trap. 5 decks below, Joaquin Morales watched the launch preparations on closed-circuit monitors, his cleaning cart positioned outside the carrier's primary radar control room. The modifications he'd made to the ship's defensive systems would activate automatically when Iranian boats entered the carrier group's defensive perimeter, but he still had time to undo them. 3 years of maintaining his cover, 3 years of convincing himself that he was protecting his family while serving a greater good. But watching those pilots prepare to launch into unknown danger made him question every choice that had led him to this moment. Ghost's FA-18 Super Hornet rolled toward the catapult with the deliberate pace of a predator approaching its hunting ground. The aircraft's twin tails stood 30 feet above the deck, adorned with squadron markings that told the story of American naval aviation, an eagle clutching arrows and an olive branch, symbolizing a nation's capacity for both war and peace. Ghost had never been particularly patriotic in the flag-waving sense, but she understood that the symbol represented something deeper than nationalism. It represented the idea that some things were worth defending, even when the cost might be everything you had to give. The catapult crew attached the launch bridle to her aircraft's nose gear, connecting 70,000 pounds of fighter jet to a steam-powered system capable of accelerating her from 0 to 150 miles per hour in less than 3 seconds. Ghost felt the familiar pre-launch tension that came from trusting her life to controlled violence, the carefully managed explosion of steam and steel that would hurl her into the air with enough force to compress her spine and blur her vision. She'd made this launch over 300 times, but it never became routine. Each catapult shot was a reminder that naval aviation existed at the intersection of precision and chaos, where microscopic errors could result in catastrophic failure. "Ghost, you're cleared for launch," came the voice from the tower. "Winds are light and variable, ceiling unlimited. Have a good flight." She pushed her throttles to military power, feeling the engines respond with the aggressive rumble of machinery designed for combat. The catapult officer gave the traditional salute, pointing toward the bow in a gesture that linked her to every naval aviator who'd launched from carrier decks since World War II. Ghost returned the salute, then braced herself as the catapult fired. The acceleration was instantaneous and violent, pressing her back into her ejection seat as the carrier's deck blurred past her canopy. In 2.5 seconds, she transitioned from a stationary aircraft to a flying machine climbing away from the ship at 160 miles per hour, carried aloft by the perfect marriage of human skill and mechanical power. The sensation never got old. The moment when tons of metal achieved the temporary miracle of flight, defying gravity through the application of physics principles that still seemed magical despite their mathematical predictability. As Ghost climbed through 5,000 feet, she looked back at the carrier, its massive deck already preparing for the launch of the next aircraft in the sequence. From this altitude, the ship looked like a child's toy floating on an infinite blue carpet, but she knew it represented the accumulated military and industrial might of a superpower. The carrier group included destroyers, cruisers, submarines, and supply ships, a floating city designed to project American power anywhere on the planet's surface. It was an impressive display of technological capability, but Ghost had learned not to confuse impressive with invincible. Her radio crackled with the routine communications of a formation coming together, pilots checking in with their call signs, confirming their positions, and establishing the communication protocols that would keep them coordinated during the mission. Shark's voice cut through the chatter with his typical cockiness. "Ghost, try to keep up today. I'd hate to have to come back and rescue you." The comment was delivered as humor, but Ghost heard the underlying assumption that she was the weak link in their formation, the pilot most likely to need assistance if things went wrong. She didn't bother responding. Actions would speak more clearly than words, and if the morning developed as her instincts suggested it might, Shark would have plenty of opportunities to reconsider his assessment of her capabilities. The Iranian fast attack boats had been moving since before sunrise, their commanders following a plan that had been rehearsed dozens of times in the narrow waters between Iranian naval bases and the shipping lanes that carried 40% of the world's seaborne oil. The boats themselves were descendants of designs originally developed for the narrow waterways of the Mekong Delta, small, fast, and equipped with weapons systems that could inflict disproportionate damage when used with tactical intelligence and absolute commitment. Commander Javed Hassani stood on the bridge of his lead boat, watching his squadron take their assigned positions with the pride of a chess master moving pieces toward checkmate. The Americans had superior technology, but they also had superior arrogance, and Hassani had spent 15 years studying the patterns of American naval operations in the Persian Gulf. They flew predictable routes, responded to threats with overwhelming force, and assumed that their technological advantages made them invulnerable to the kind of asymmetric warfare that had been perfected in these waters over centuries of conflict. Today's operation would demonstrate the limitations of American power projection. His boats carried Chinese-manufactured cruise missiles with Iranian targeting systems, weapons that could reach American ships 40 miles away and deliver warheads capable of mission-killing a destroyer or severely damaging a carrier. The missiles were untested in combat, but Hassani had confidence in their capabilities because he'd helped design the targeting systems during his years as a naval engineering student in Tehran. The key to success would be coordination and timing. His boats would remain hidden among the commercial shipping traffic until American patrol aircraft were exactly where his intelligence sources predicted they would be. Then, in a coordinated strike lasting less than 10 minutes, they would launch enough missiles to overwhelm the carrier group's defensive systems and demonstrate Iran's ability to control access to the Strait of Hormuz. The goal wasn't to sink American ships. That would invite devastating retaliation, but to damage them badly enough to force a reconsideration of America's military presence in the region. Hassani checked his watch and felt the familiar mixture of anticipation and fear that preceded combat. In 90 minutes, he would either be celebrated as a hero of the Islamic Republic or floating face down in water that had claimed warriors for 3,000 years. The outcome would depend on factors beyond his control: the accuracy of his intelligence, the reliability of his weapons, and the competence of the American pilots who were climbing into their aircraft 60 miles away. What he didn't know was that one of his most valuable intelligence sources was having second thoughts about his role in the coming battle. Joaquin Morales stood outside the carrier's communications center, his mop bucket providing perfect camouflage for activities that had nothing to do with deck maintenance. Through the reinforced windows, he could see technicians monitoring the radar screens that tracked every aircraft, ship, and potential threat within a 100-mile radius of the carrier group. The systems he'd modified would create blind spots in that coverage, gaps that would allow Iranian boats to approach undetected until they were close enough to launch their missiles. For 3 years, Morales had rationalized his activities as victimless intelligence gathering, convincing himself that the information he provided was too routine to endanger anyone. But as he watched radar operators preparing to guide American pilots through what they believed was a safe patrol mission, he realized he'd been complicit in creating a trap that could kill people who'd never done anything to threaten him or his family. The encrypted phone in his cleaning supplies buzzed once, signaling that Iranian forces were moving into their attack positions. His handlers expected him to confirm that the carrier's defensive modifications were in place and functioning. One text message would complete his betrayal, ensuring that American pilots would fly into an ambush without adequate warning. But as he looked at the faces of sailors who trusted him enough to ignore his presence among their most sensitive equipment, Morales felt something break inside his conscience. He thought about Lieutenant Commander Reeves, the quiet pilot who'd always treated him with the same respectful professionalism she showed everyone else on the ship. She was probably airborne by now, flying a patrol mission that would become a combat mission in less than an hour. The modifications he'd made to the ship's radar systems would delay threat warnings by 47 seconds, enough time for Iranian missiles to reach their targets before the carrier group could respond effectively. Morales pulled out the encrypted phone and stared at the message screen. 3 years of careful preparation had led to this moment, but he was no longer certain he could complete the mission that had defined his secret life since 2019. The choice was simple in its complexity: protect his family by betraying his shipmates, or protect his shipmates by accepting whatever consequences his handlers might visit on the people he loved most. His finger hovered over the send button as Ghost's FA-18 Super Hornet disappeared into the morning haze, carrying its pilot toward a confrontation that could redefine the balance of power in the Persian Gulf. Ghost leveled off at 25,000 feet, where the sky was the color of deep sapphires, and the Persian Gulf spread below like a sheet of hammered bronze. Her Super Hornet cruised at 400 knots, its engines whisper quiet at this altitude, while she monitored the tactical display that showed the positions of her fellow pilots spread across 30 miles of airspace. The morning sun painted everything in shades of gold and amber, beautiful enough to make her forget momentarily that she was flying over one of the world's most contested waterways. The routine patrol pattern would take them along the Strait of Hormuz, following shipping lanes that carried tankers loaded with crude oil destined for refineries in Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Ghost had flown this route dozens of times, watching commercial traffic that represented the economic lifeblood of industrial civilization. A single disruption of oil flow through these waters could trigger fuel shortages and economic chaos across multiple continents, which was why American naval forces maintained a constant presence in the region. Her radar warning receiver remained silent, indicating no active enemy radar systems in the area, but Ghost's instincts suggested otherwise. 15 years of flying combat missions had taught her to distinguish between the absence of threats and the presence of threats that were hiding. The Iranian naval exercises reported by intelligence were supposedly taking place 50 miles to the northeast, but Ghost had learned not to trust the accuracy of intelligence reports when her life depended on their reliability. She keyed her radio. "Shark Ghost, I'm picking up increased radio chatter on Iranian military frequencies. Recommend we tighten our formation and prepare for possible contact." Shark's response carried his typical dismissive confidence. "Roger, Ghost. Probably just training exercises. These guys couldn't hit water if they fell out of a boat." The comment reflected the dangerous arrogance that Ghost had encountered throughout her career, the assumption that American technological superiority made tactical intelligence unnecessary. Through her heads-up display, Ghost tracked the movement of surface vessels in the shipping lanes below. Most showed the steady, predictable courses of commercial traffic, but several smaller contacts were moving with the irregular patterns that suggested military vessels attempting to blend with civilian shipping. She noted their positions and headings, building a mental map of potential threats that might not show up on her radar until they revealed themselves by launching weapons. The tactical radio frequency crackled with routine position reports from the other aircraft in her formation, but Ghost noticed that the communication patterns were too regular, too predictable. They were following standard protocols that had been established for peacetime patrols, not the randomized communication schedules that smart pilots used when operating in contested airspace. If Iranian intelligence services were monitoring American radio traffic, they would have little difficulty tracking the patrol's position and predicting its movements. Ghost made a decision that violated standard operating procedures, but reflected the judgment that had kept her alive through 2 combat deployments. She switched to an alternate radio frequency and broke formation, climbing to 30,000 feet while maintaining her eastward heading. If her patrol was flying into an ambush, she wanted to be in a position to provide support when her fellow pilots realized they needed help. The deviation from flight plan would probably result in a reprimand from her squadron commander, but Ghost had learned to prioritize survival over strict adherence to procedures. Better to face administrative consequences for unauthorized tactical decisions than to have her family receive a folded flag and a letter explaining that she'd followed regulations right up to the moment when following regulations got her killed. As she climbed through 28,000 feet, Ghost caught sight of something that made her blood run cold. The contrails of multiple aircraft climbing rapidly from low altitude, their flight paths converging on the patrol route her squadron had been following. The aircraft were too far away to identify visually, but their behavior suggested interceptors launching from Iranian airfields to engage American patrols that had wandered too close to sensitive military installations. Far below, Commander Javed Hassani watched American patrol aircraft approaching the coordinates his intelligence sources had provided with mathematical precision. The Americans were following their predictable flight patterns, maintaining standard formation spacing, and communicating on frequencies that Iranian electronic warfare specialists had been monitoring for months. Everything was proceeding according to the plan he'd rehearsed dozens of times in simulation exercises. His boats had taken position among a group of commercial tankers, using the larger vessel's radar signatures to mask their own presence until the moment came to reveal their weapons. Each boat carried 4 cruise missiles with range enough to engage the American carrier group from beyond the effective range of the ship's defensive systems. The missiles were programmed with target coordinates provided by Iranian intelligence services, coordinates that would be updated in real time by spotters positioned throughout the region. Hassani's radio operator reported that Iranian Air Force interceptors were airborne and moving to engage American patrol aircraft, part of a coordinated operation designed to overwhelm American forces with simultaneous threats from multiple directions. The Americans would have to choose between defending their aircraft or defending their ships, and either choice would create vulnerabilities that Iranian forces could exploit with devastating effect. But as Hassani watched his radar screen, he noticed that one American aircraft had deviated from its predicted flight path, climbing to high altitude and breaking formation. The deviation was subtle, possibly a navigation error or routine course adjustment, but it suggested that at least one American pilot was not following the predictable patterns that made the ambush possible. That pilot would have to be neutralized quickly before she could warn the rest of her formation about the trap they were flying into. Hassani keyed his tactical radio. "All units, implement Plan Delta immediately. We have a deviation in target patterns. Recommend immediate weapons release before American forces can reorganize." His squadron commanders acknowledged the order and began the final preparations for an attack that would demonstrate Iran's ability to inflict serious casualties on American forces operating in the Persian Gulf. The next 10 minutes would determine whether Iranian asymmetric warfare tactics could overcome American technological superiority, or whether superior training and equipment would prevail over determination and surprise. Hassani had spent his entire naval career preparing for this moment, but he was about to learn that the outcome would depend on factors that no amount of planning could predict or control. 60 miles away, Joaquin Morales stared at the encrypted phone in his trembling hands, knowing that the next few seconds would define not only his own fate, but the fate of pilots who were about to fly into the deadliest trap in Persian Gulf naval history. The radar warning receiver in Ghost's cockpit exploded into electronic chaos as Iranian surface-to-air missile systems painted her aircraft with targeting radar from 3 different directions. The distinctive warbling tone meant that multiple missile sites were attempting to achieve firing solutions on her Super Hornet, while her tactical display lit up with threat symbology that transformed the peaceful morning sky into a 3-dimensional maze of potential death. Ghost's training took over before her conscious mind could process the scope of the threat. She rolled inverted and pulled the aircraft into a steep dive, dispensing chaff and flares while calling out the threat warning on the tactical frequency. All flights, Ghost. Multiple SAM sites active, bearing 090 through 120. We are engaged defensive. Her voice remained steady despite the adrenaline surge that made her hands shake and her vision tunnel, the product of hundreds of hours training for exactly this scenario. The response from her fellow pilots revealed the confusion that came from transitioning instantly from routine patrol to active combat. Shark's voice cut through the radio chatter with panic barely controlled. "Ghost, where the hell are you? I've lost sight and my RWR is going crazy." Lieutenant Commander Harrison's voice followed with the clipped professionalism of an experienced combat pilot. "All flights, implement combat spread immediately. This is not a drill. We are engaged by hostile forces." Through her heads-up display, Ghost tracked the launch of at least 6 surface-to-air missiles from Iranian coastal installations, their rocket motors creating bright signatures against the darker background of land and water. The missiles were climbing rapidly toward the patrol's previous altitude, but her decision to break formation and climb had taken her above their maximum engagement envelope. Her fellow pilots, still flying at their assigned altitude, were well within the missile's lethal range. Ghost keyed her radio again. "Shark, Harrison, recommend immediate climb to Angels 30 and implement defensive maneuvering. Multiple missiles inbound from the northeast." But even as she transmitted the warning, she realized that Iranian forces had planned their ambush with the precision of a chess master executing checkmate. The surface-to-air missiles were not intended to destroy American aircraft. They were intended to force them into a specific flight pattern, where they would become vulnerable to a different threat entirely. Her radar warning receiver detected new contacts climbing from low altitude. Iranian Air Force F-14 Tomcats and F-4 Phantoms, elderly aircraft upgraded with modern weapons systems, and flown by pilots who understood that they were engaging in a battle that could determine the future of their nation. The Iranian interceptors were positioning themselves between the American patrol and the carrier, cutting off their most direct escape route, while surface-launched missiles forced them into increasingly desperate maneuvering. Ghost realized she was witnessing the execution of a coordinated battle plan that had probably been years in development. Iranian forces were demonstrating a level of tactical sophistication that American intelligence had consistently underestimated, using older equipment and asymmetric tactics to create a situation where technological superiority might not guarantee victory. The morning patrol was outnumbered, outmaneuvered, and rapidly running out of altitude and airspace in which to conduct defensive operations. She rolled her aircraft toward the threat axis and selected air-to-air missiles, knowing that the next few minutes would test everything she'd learned about aerial combat. The Iranian pilots climbing toward her position were flying aircraft that had been obsolete when she was born, but they were flying them with the desperate skill of people defending their homeland against what they perceived as foreign aggression. Technology might give her an advantage, but it wouldn't guarantee survival against opponents who were prepared to trade their lives for the opportunity to inflict casualties on American forces. As the first Iranian fighter came within missile range, Ghost felt the familiar calm that descended over her consciousness during combat. Time seemed to slow, her vision became preternaturally sharp, and her hands moved across the aircraft's controls with the fluid precision of a concert pianist executing a complex composition. This was why they called her Ghost, not because she was pale or quiet, but because in combat she seemed to transcend the normal limitations of human reaction time and spatial awareness. But even as she prepared to engage the Iranian interceptors, Ghost knew that the air-to-air battle was only one element of a larger trap that was still unfolding. Somewhere below, Iranian naval forces were positioning themselves to strike at the carrier group, and the Americans were about to learn that their opponents had been studying their tactics, capabilities, and weaknesses for much longer than anyone had realized. Commander Javed Hassani watched the air battle developing overhead with the satisfaction of a tactician whose plan was executing perfectly. American patrol aircraft were exactly where his intelligence sources had predicted they would be, and Iranian Air Force interceptors were engaging them according to a coordinated battle plan that had been rehearsed dozens of times in simulation exercises. The Americans were responding predictably, using superior technology and training to fight their way out of what they perceived as a trap, but they hadn't yet realized that the air battle was designed to distract them from the real threat. His fast attack boats remained hidden among the commercial shipping traffic, their cruise missiles armed and programmed with targeting coordinates for the American carrier group. The missiles had range enough to reach their targets from 40 miles away, putting them beyond the effective range of most American defensive systems. More importantly, the missiles would arrive at their targets while American fighter aircraft were engaged in air-to-air combat and unable to provide close-in defense of their ships. Hassani's radio operator reported that Iranian intelligence sources were transmitting real-time updates on American ship positions, course headings, and defensive postures. The information was so detailed and current that it could only be coming from someone with direct access to American tactical networks, someone who had been providing intelligence to Iranian services for an extended period. Hassani didn't know the identity of his intelligence source, but he was grateful for information that made his mission not just possible but likely to succeed. The attack plan called for a coordinated missile strike against 3 targets: the carrier's flight deck, its island superstructure, and its nuclear reactor compartment. The goal was not to sink the ship. That would require dozens of missiles and invite devastating American retaliation, but to damage it severely enough to force its withdrawal from the Persian Gulf and demonstrate Iran's ability to control access to the region's shipping lanes. Hassani checked his watch and felt the familiar pre-combat tension that came from knowing that success or failure would be determined in the next few minutes. His crews had trained for this mission for years, but no amount of training could predict how American defensive systems would respond to a coordinated cruise missile attack. He was about to discover whether Iranian asymmetric warfare doctrine could overcome American technological superiority, or whether superior equipment and training would prevail over determination and surprise. He keyed his tactical radio. "All units, prepare for weapons release on my command. Target coordinates have been updated and confirmed. This is not a drill." His squadron commanders acknowledged the order, and Hassani felt the weight of history settling on his shoulders. The next 10 minutes would either establish him as a hero of the Islamic Republic or result in his death in waters that had witnessed naval warfare for 3 millennia. But as he prepared to give the order that would launch Iran's most ambitious military operation in decades, Hassani had no way of knowing that his intelligence advantage was about to disappear, eliminated by the conscience of a man who had finally decided that some betrayals were too great to justify, regardless of the personal consequences. Joaquin Morales had made his decision. Standing in the carrier's communications center, surrounded by radar screens that showed American aircraft engaging Iranian forces in the deadly ballet of aerial combat, he realized that 3 years of rationalization and self-deception had led him to a moment where further delay would make him complicit in the deaths of people who had never done anything to threaten him or his family. His hands shook as he accessed the computer terminal that controlled the carrier's defensive radar systems, entering the command codes that would undo the modifications he had made over the past 18 months. Each keystroke felt like a small act of redemption, restoring the ship's ability to detect and track threats with the full sensitivity and range that its designers had intended. The process took less than 90 seconds, but those seconds felt like the longest of his life. The encrypted phone in his cleaning supplies buzzed insistently, displaying messages from his handlers that demanded confirmation.